Well, next up, I'd like to invite to the stage Steve Jurvetson. Steve Jurvetson is a partner at DFJ with current board responsibilities including SpaceX, Synthetic Genomics, and Tesla Motors. He's a founding VC investor in Hotmail and also has an engineering background. Right?
Yeah.
So again, we've kind of talked about the engineering and the science of this threat, of this challenge. What do you think the leadership potential or the leadership need is to be able to really make a change at this point?
Great. And is this mic working, or should I use this one? Is it? Good hand? Great. Yeah, it is an interesting question. There's an obvious need, but a lack of action. And sometimes you ask yourself why, and it can be a sort of not in my backyard kind of problem. No one feels kind of the same responsibility for the planet, perhaps, that they should. And I think, and I'm optimistic that this might be changing. And so the perspective I bring is that of an investor in startups and the entrepreneurs that we invest in. And in the 90s, you know, everybody that we invested in was looking at a US market, and that was it. That was like the scope of their vision, at least for the first 5 to 7 years. And then we sort of passed on to global entrepreneurship around energy and clean tech, or trying to make all electric vehicles take over the planet and sort of make an impact at the planetary scale. And then you have companies like SpaceX trying to change other worlds and thinking with this sort of breathless kind of scope of ambition. And so the reason I belabor that point is I think that the long arc of human history has moved from sort of tribal, family level kinds of parochial concerns to maybe cities and feudal lords, to nation states, to patriotism, and now globalism, and now maybe something a little bit broader than just our existence on this planet, and a desire to be a multi-planetary species. So with that milieu, I think the time is ripe for some kind of leader, be it a political leader, policy leader, entrepreneur, civic or business leaders, to rise up and sort of take this mantle. And you see it, of course, with B612 Foundation. You see it with a variety of initiatives that might not have made as much logical sense 20, 30 years ago. It just wouldn't feel like, oh yes, small groups of people can actually get things of that scale done, right?
So what are the challenges that you think we have to overcome to make this reality? I mean, obviously there's raising money and maybe this shift in perspective that we were talking about earlier. But what are some of the other challenges that you think we need to overcome to make this happen?
Well, you need to convince a lot of people that something is possible. And you can see that there's, piggybacking on fear, be it, in the media or events that occur, but you don't want to wait for something that scares people, then it's too late. The more positive attractor usually comes when you see some signs of visible success. And so I think if you look, for example, at adjacent areas like in the new space sector, and the excitement around a SpaceX or Planet Labs that I'm involved with in my professional life, there, I believe, is a sense that you can treat this problem in the same way you might treat what may be a daunting problem, is taking steps, resolve the technical risk, prove that you can launch the solution, and then attract other kinds of entities that would support it once you've removed the early stage risk. Kind of like we do as venture capitalists. We can't fund a project like Tesla Motors to fruition. It just takes billions of dollars, or bring a SpaceX program to market. But we can provide some of that early capital, much like I personally try to do in supporting groups like B612, that can get it through the technical hurdles, that then gets more credibility, and it sort of builds and builds. So I think funding for projects is now very ripe, because the magnitude of what we're talking about is roughly 10 times lower than what anyone thought it would have probably cost just 10 years ago. Thanks to Moore's Law, thanks to advances in sensors, thanks to advances in lowering the cost of access to space. And so when you have the confluence of plummeting costs, greater scope of ambition of a lot of individuals and entrepreneurs like a Larry Page or an Elon Musk himself, like, wow, we could actually make a difference with our personal capital in this regard. I think you can start to get that ball rolling.
So do you think it's a few sort of angel investors, or is it a groundswell of many people stepping up?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, in our industry, we see all types simultaneously, and here there's something in my gut that says there's a series of stages of individuals, because you're convincing one person, and then larger entities that might have a little more fear based in them, where they don't want to look like a fool. They may represent institutional pools of capital, and they don't want to make foolish mistakes, and so they usually like to wait until there's the warmth of the herd around, and that typically comes later. But they write the big checks, and so. If you could draw analogies to large projects like the Keck Observatory, or both at the government level and at the private level, how do things like this get funding? And I think it'll naturally go through smaller entities for smaller checks, and then larger entities for larger checks. Could even be corporate.
But I guess with the initial sort of movement toward thinking more globally, just in kind of our general culture and economics, as well as sort of now having broken open the space as being something that was purely for governments, and now is something that businesses take on. With those two kind of aspects, do you think we have enough, or are there more kind of elements that need to come into place?
Well, I'm personally a bit of a cynic on the government side at all. Like, I'm not counting on it in anything I do at work. And so it'd be nice if you didn't have to rely on them for anything, ever. I mean, that would be ideal. Now, to the extent they can help and do help, and there are certain things like the Deep Space Network and resources they can afford, but to actually assume proactive effort in your direction would be great, but I'm not counting on it. So what I really find exciting is the prospect that you don't need any of that at all. And the analogies I might draw is you have groups like SpaceX, hell-bent for leather to colonize Mars. Not just get to Mars, but bring 1 million people to Mars, right? And people don't laugh at them anymore. I mean, they got to pause and think, like, that's actually plausible. That actually feels like something that could happen. You have a separate sort of group of people brainstorming a permanent lunar base at a total cost of $1 billion. $1 billion, and then it'll be economically self-sustaining given current technologies. That's pretty breathtaking. There'll soon, in the next few weeks, be announced another initiative financed by another billionaire investor type to do interstellar missions, to go outside our solar system and do actual deep space missions privately funded. And of course, B612 has an ambitious program that would pretty much provide an enormous benefit and solve many of the, and sort of be the impetus for solving many of the problems that cost less than the building we're in here today. So I personally like the idea of protecting all the artifacts, for a comparable dollars. I like this too, but I can't see why we wouldn't do both.
Well, it's great. And certainly compared to an interstellar mission, B612 sounds like a very tractable.
Oh yeah, I mean, getting to Venus, piece of cake.
All right. Well, thanks very much for your time. Thanks for coming up and joining us this afternoon. And if you have any questions, folks in the audience can find you and ask.
Sure.
But thanks
Okay,
for your time.
thank you.
All right, thanks. Great to meet you.
Thank you. Perfect.
Yeah.